The biopsy chip is engineered to process, cut, and behave like actual tissue. This makes the techniques used in facing in and cutting the block very similar to your lab. This video is not intended to train in the actual use of the microtome to face in and section, but rather assumes that such knowledge and skill already exists and strives to couple it with techniques in working with the biopsy chip. We assure this information will provide confidence in its use in your lab and that you will be successful in doing so. Before we get started, there are some important preparation pieces to know in order to cut and section successfully. Much of this training will be focused on understanding and implementing such preparations. Any challenges in the sectioning process may likely point back to adhering to the following practices: making sure the block is free of wax to sit flush in the microtome, the optional step of trimming the block, and most importantly, ensuring the block is very cold and liquid free. The first two steps can occur at the end of the embedding process, or they can be performed prior to taking sections. Regardless, if steps 1 and 2 are taken, be sure they occur before the blocks become cold in step 3. In order to face and cut sections evenly, be sure that the edges of the block are clear of excess wax so that it will sit flush in the microtome chuck. We do this by using a hot plate to remove any wax through heat and light friction on the edges of the cassette side of the block. Know that this step is optional. However, if more than 2 sections on a slide are desired, we recommend trimming the block to allow up to 3 sections onto a slide. Our pathologists prefer 3 levels or sections, so to accomplish this, we use a razor blade to trim the extra width of the paraffin surrounding the biopsy chip. Place the blade no closer than 2 millimeters from the chip, then with both hands on each corners of the blade, press down and away at a 45-degree angle to make the trim. Be sure to leave enough paraffin surrounding the biopsy chip, as this will provide more structure in cutting. There are 2 important factors in order to cut successfully, and they are that the blocks must be as cold as possible and to not be in any contact with moisture. This is the most important preparation piece before facing in and sectioning. A good portion of this video will be explaining the steps using a freezer, as well as alternative means to make sure the blocks are cold enough and free of moisture to cut well. We found it is most ideal to have a small freezer next to the cutting station. This will not only allow fast and convenient transfers to and from the freezer, but is especially optimal in keeping the blocks very cold between the steps of facing in and sectioning. Using the freezer will also eliminate the concern of any water pooling or condensation forming on any ice used. Our freezers are also rated to -20 degrees, so 5 minutes is adequate time between steps. It may require longer depending on the temperature of the freezer you choose to use. The facing in and sectioning steps while using a freezer next to the cutting station would look as follows. Place blocks in the freezer after embedding or trimming for at least 5 minutes. Remove a block from the freezer to face it in. Once complete, place the block back into the freezer for another 5 minutes. Repeat for all blocks being faced in. And finally, remove the blocks one at a time from the freezer to section. Although it is ideal for a freezer to be next to the cutting station, if it is simply not feasible, there are other methods of keeping the blocks as cold as possible. This is where talking about moisture is relevant and a concern to be aware of. Where possible, allow the blocks a head start in getting cold by placing them in a freezer for a few minutes. Once cold, remove the blocks and place biopsy chip down onto either a block of ice or an ice pack to keep cold. Then transfer the blocks to the cutting station. Just as the steps mentioned in using a freezer, remove the blocks one at a time off the ice or ice pack to face in, then place back onto the ice to recool. Repeat this again one at a time for sectioning. One thing that may keep the blocks from warming is to sandwich them with another ice pack placed on top. Now let's shift gears in discussing how any moisture can be eliminated in alternative options to using a freezer. Do not place the blocks directly onto either ice or an ice pack alone. The biopsy chip will absorb any water, causing it to swell and protrude out of the block. Ice melts and ice packs gather condensation, so if the blocks are being placed onto ice, one option is to leave the blocks in the embedding molds to act as a sure barrier. If the blocks are being placed onto ice packs, the embedding molds can be used, or lab absorption paper can be placed between the blocks and the ice pack to absorb condensation. Now that we've covered the preparation pieces, let's continue on with the remaining steps in the sectioning process. Remove the block from the freezer or otherwise the ice block or pack and place it into the microtone chuck with the biopsy chip's length running up and down or portrait in orientation. Face into the block by doing the first 2 to 3 turns at 8 to 15 microns, then an additional few turns at the desired thickness, likely 3 to 5 microns. Tissue may not immediately be seen in the sections because the tissue will sit in the channels slightly lower than the channel dividers. Continue facing through the top of the dividers until the tissue appears. Here is another view of facing into the block that shows the addition of the microtone hand being used for reference. Keep in mind that you may likely cut through more wax in facing in than you are accustomed to. This is again because the channel dividers in the biopsy chip are slightly taller than the tissue sitting in them. Continue until the tissue has appeared evenly, then cool the blocks once again to prepare for sectioning. Before taking sections, make certain all areas of the biopsy chip and tissue are visible. A couple tips to help know if you have faced in far enough is to remove the block and hold it up to the light. Another option that works great is to place a section onto the water bath and observe to determine the presence of tissue and that the full lengths of cores are visible. Tissue should be sectioned at 4 microns, and the number of sections taken will depend on the protocol of your lab. We at Lumea typically collect additional sections during the initial process so that the need to section the block a second time, including refacing in, is minimized to reserve tissue. Once more, because of the similar nature of the biopsy chip to cut like tissue, there are no special considerations for the performing of actual sectioning. As long as the preparation steps have been followed, you should find that the process is just like your previous experience. Loading the sections onto slides is very straightforward and has no differences compared to standard loading techniques, other than of course doing it far fewer times per case. Loading 3 sections or levels onto a slide is again possible from trimming the block as explained in the preparation steps. The result is that up to 18 cores can be mounted onto a single slide. Trimming again is not necessary if only obtaining 2 levels. Any extra sections cut in preparation for potential special stain requests should be loaded onto slides as well. We recommend following your lab's protocol for staining, and drying time is fairly standard in using the biopsy chip. You can refer to the guide if you'd like for the drying process we use. Now this wraps up our training on this section and all of the processes in using the biopsy chip in the lab. Refer back to these videos often and be sure to reference the biopsy chip guide for additional information and frequently asked questions. As always, please reach out to us in however we can assist you in implementing and adopting this revolutionary technology into your lab. Thank you.